Welcome to this explainer. You know, for around 250 years, no foreign army has successfully conquered the United States. Literally every superpower since the nation's founding has looked at a map and realized that invading America isn't just war, it's pretty much suicide. Today, we're going to tackle a seriously fascinating scenario. We're diving straight into the geographic, demographic, and technological data to figure out if the U.S. mainland could actually survive a full-scale, conventional military invasion.
So, let's move past all the grand military theory for a second and ask a really brutal, practical question. What would actually happen if a foreign army tried to conquer the United States? Think about it. What if alliances collapsed, the screens went dark, and America had to survive a full-scale invasion totally on its own? What would that war literally look like on the ground?
Section 1. The rare precedents, or when the shield actually cracked.
Okay, to understand the present, we really have to look at the past. There are essentially only 3 historical breaches of the U.S. mainland. Back in 1814, the British actually burned Washington, D.C., forcing the president to literally flee. That's the only time a foreign army has ever held the U.S. Capitol. Then, a century later, in 1916, Pancho Villa's men raided New Mexico and just vanished right back across the border. And finally, in 1942, Japan took 2 tiny, frozen islands up in Alaska. But here is the absolutely crucial takeaway. Even when invaders managed to briefly land, the unforgiving terrain and extreme conditions repelled them incredibly fast. I mean, when the U.S. took back those Alaskan islands, the harsh, frozen terrain actually killed almost as many troops as the enemy did. That's how brutal the land itself is.
Moving on to Layer 1, the ocean moats.
5,000 miles. Let that sink in for a second. The Pacific Ocean alone is a 5,000-mile-wide moving wall of violent storms, unpredictable currents, and just absolute emptiness. Imagine trying to push an entire military force across all of that. It's basically a gigantic geographic moat that has historically choked even the most terrifying superpowers. It's the exact reason Hitler never tried to cross the Atlantic, and why Japan restricted its attack just to Hawaii. It is simply way too far, way too hard, and insanely costly.
To really wrap our heads around the logistics of that kind of distance, consider this. When the U.S. tried the reverse, invading across the Pacific during World War II, it took 3 full years, tens of thousands of ships, and massive floating cities just for fuel. Fast forward to today, and honestly, the logistics haven't gotten much easier for an invading force. A modern carrier group burns through millions of gallons of fuel every single week. Trying to push an entire invasion force across 5,000 miles of open water means weeks of complete exposure and just unimaginable fuel consumption. It's a logistical nightmare.
Let's look at Layer 2, fortress coastlines and terrain.
Now let's say an enemy fleet somehow miraculously makes it across the water and targets the Pacific Northwest. If they're expecting nice, flat, sunny beaches, they are in for a rude awakening. Instead, they'd find a fortress built not by generals, but by geology itself. They'd hit places like the Olympic Peninsula, where cliffs rise almost straight up out of the freezing ocean. We're talking about an environment where storms slam the coast like literal artillery fire, and some spots get 12 feet of rain a year. This isn't just weather, guys, it's war. The coastline is so vicious, packed with sharp rocks and constantly shifting sandbars, that sailors literally call it the graveyard of the Pacific. Over 2,000 ships have vanished there. That is nearly 1 shipwreck for every 3 miles of shore. Even during peacetime, spots like the Columbia River Bar are so ridiculously dangerous that pilots need special licenses just to cross. And they still lose ships to a single wrong swell.
And, you know, even if an invading army somehow managed to secure a landing zone, the internal geography of the North American continent is incredibly hostile. Every single mile is different, and every single region punishes an army. You've got the Rocky Mountains slicing the West right in half, the mighty Mississippi River flooding its massive plains, the Appalachian Mountains twisting the East into endless, confusing ridges. And out west, well, the Great Plains offer absolutely nowhere to hide from drones, while the deserts will literally kill engines with extreme heat, and the brutal winters will just shatter them with ice. Nation doesn't just slow down invaders here, it actively starves them out by cutting off refuel points and stretching supply lines way past their breaking point.
That brings us to Layer 3, the 330 million person militia.
Any invading force stepping off those beaches would immediately face a truly terrifying demographic reality. The United States has a population of around 330 million people, right? But get this, it has 390 million civilian-owned firearms. That breaks down to roughly 120 firearms for every 100 citizens. So we're not just talking about an armed populace here. This creates the potential for 50 million separate militias stretching all the way from Maine to Montana and Texas to Alaska. Basically, every single home essentially becomes its own stronghold.
And it goes even deeper. If you look at the subdemographics, the United States has roughly 15 million licensed hunters. Just think about that number. That alone is a localized, armed, and geographically aware force that's actually larger than most national militaries around the globe. These are folks who know their local terrain perfectly. They know how to track, and they stock ammunition like it's winter food.
All of this perfectly contextualizes that famous quote often attributed to Japanese Admiral Yamamoto. He supposedly said, "We could never invade America. Behind every blade of grass is a gun." Now, whether he actually said those exact words or not, the sentiment is mathematically spot on. A ground invasion would trigger the largest, bloodiest guerrilla war in human history. If you think about how major superpowers have been bled dry in places like Afghanistan by rebel forces with just a few 100,000 rifles, try to imagine an enemy attempting to fight a population armed with hundreds of millions of them. It's almost unthinkable.
Next up is Layer 4, the unblinking eye.
Here's the thing about modern warfare. Sneaking an army into the country is essentially impossible today, because an invasion fundamentally relies on the element of surprise. But secrecy? Yeah, secrecy died decades ago. Back in 1991, U.S. military satellites were already fully capable of spotting enemy tanks hiding under the desert sand. Today, those same satellite networks can literally read a license plate from orbit. Drones can hover for days on end, and radar completely blankets both oceans. A massive invasion fleet trying to cross the Pacific wouldn't be a surprise attack. It would be a glowing thermal trail of metal, tracked constantly for weeks before it ever even got close to Hawaii. You just simply cannot sneak an invasion across a planet that's covered in sensors.
And waiting at the end of that highly publicized, super slow journey is the most battle-tested military in history. The U.S. Navy operates 11 aircraft carriers. To put that into perspective, that is double what the entire rest of the world has combined. The Air Force has the capability to strike literally anywhere on Earth within a matter of hours. And domestically, there are National Guard units in every single state who know every local bridge, every valley, and every back road. Even if a port somehow fell, American reinforcements would fly in from bases in Guam, Japan, and Germany within a single day.
Which leads us to our final section, the real threat within.
So, because of physical invasion across oceans into incredibly hostile terrain against a heavily armed populace and a high-tech military is effectively suicide, modern enemies have completely pivoted their strategy. If an enemy wants to conquer America today, they're looking for shortcuts to break the country digitally before a single boot ever touches the ground. Step 1 of this modern invasion plan involves massive cyber attacks to kill the grid. We're talking crashing the stock market, scrambling air traffic, or even using an EMP blast so cars just stall out and the power dies, instantly reverting 21st century America right back to the 19th century. Step 2 is launching highly targeted disinformation, fake news, and manufactured outrage. And step 3? Using all of that to turn neighbors into rivals. Because let's be honest, dividing 330 million minds using algorithms and echo chambers is infinitely easier and far cheaper than trying to cross 5,000 miles of ocean.
Now, you might be wondering, okay, but what about doomsday weapons, bioweapons, viruses, or nuclear arms that can just erase cities in minutes? Well, even resorting to those isn't a viable invasion strategy. You can't exactly conquer a radioactive wasteland, right? More importantly, America's second strike arsenal guarantees mutual extinction. If the U.S. mainland burns, the attacker burns right along with it. So instead, enemies tend to rely heavily on posturing, big missile parades and loud threats that never actually cross the ocean.
And this brings us to a really haunting reality that was actually identified over a century and a half ago. Abraham Lincoln once warned, "If destruction be our lot, we must be its author and finisher." The incredible geographic, military, and civilian shields protecting the United States essentially mean that if the country ever truly falls, it is not going to be to foreign tanks or foreign ships. The only thing that could ever truly conquer America is America itself, through deep division, hatred, and internal civil collapse.
Ultimately, the endless oceans, the treacherous land, the heavily armed population, and the ever-watchful technology make an outside conquest effectively impossible. The American shield is absolutely impenetrable from the outside, which leaves us with this final vital question to really chew on. If an outside force can never breach the walls, is the only successful invasion the one that starts from within? Think about how our digital spaces operate today and ask yourself, are we already fighting the only war we could actually lose?